It was just another typical afternoon when I pulled up to my driveway after running errands. Bags in hand. Ready to wind down from a busy day. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow across the neighborhood. I parked my car in my usual spot. A space I had used countless times without a single issue. But today, something felt off. As I stepped out of the car, I noticed Karen standing at the edge of my property. Arms crossed and her usual smug expression plastered across her face. She wasn't just standing there for a friendly chat, she had a mission. That car is in violation of HOA regulations, Karen snapped. Before I even had the chance to grab my bags from the back seat. Her tone was sharp, accusatory, as if she had caught me doing something truly criminal. I paused for a second, looking at the car in question. It was just a regular black sedan, unassuming. Plain. No logos. No signs. Nothing that screamed commercial vehicle. I raised an eyebrow, already feeling the frustration bubbling up. Karen? That's not a commercial vehicle, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. But it was clear that I was losing my patience. Karen? Of course. Wasn't hearing any of it. She pulled out a laminated booklet from her tote bag with the precise grace of someone about to make a point. We have clear rules about what kind of vehicles are permitted to be parked in driveways overnight, she said, waving the booklet at me like it was some sacred text. That thing. Absolutely unacceptable. I frowned, knowing where this was heading. Karen? There's no way that's a commercial vehicle. There are no logos. No signs? It's just a regular car. But she wasn't listening. Her voice grew more self-assured as she pulled out a phone and dialed a number. I've already reported it to the board. If it's not moved within the next hour, I'll be calling a tow truck, she declared with the finality of someone who believed they had the law on their side. I couldn't believe it. You can't just tow someone's car because you think it's a commercial vehicle. Karen, I said, trying to reason with her. Her eyes gleamed with petty delight. Oh. Well, I can, she said, barely containing her smugness. In fact, I already did. The tow truck's on its way. I felt my stomach drop. The audacity. The overreach. It was too much. But little did she know. Her mistake was about to cost her more than she could imagine. The sound of a tow truck rumbling down the street made my stomach churn. It was unmistakable. That low growl of the engine echoing off the pavement as it got closer and closer. Karen's grin widened, clearly pleased with herself as she watched the truck pull up to the curb. I could almost see her picturing the car being hauled away. Her supposed victory against someone who dared defy the HOA. The tow truck driver hopped out, clipboard in hand, scanning the street. Which vehicle? He asked, his voice loud enough to echo in the quiet neighborhood. Karen pointed dramatically toward the black sedan parked in my driveway. That one, she said, as if it were an order. Remove it immediately. The driver looked over the car, his brow furrowing as he approached. But instead of jumping into action, he looked at me first. You the owner of this car? He asked. No, I said, shaking my head. It belongs to my wife. Karen snorted, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Oh. And where is she? Because unless she moves it now, it's going to be towed. I smirked, leaning slightly against the car. She's at work. But I wouldn't touch that car if I were you, I said, enjoying the growing tension in the air. Karen's eyes narrowed. her expression smug as she waited for the driver to do her bidding. But I could tell she wasn't prepared for what I was about to drop on her. Because my wife. I began, drawing out each word for maximum effect, is an undercover cop. And that's an unmarked police vehicle. For the first time since this whole ordeal began. Karen's smug expression faltered. She blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Her hand tightened around her laminated rulebook, flipping through pages desperately as if she could somehow find a rule to get herself out of this mess. The tow truck driver arched an eyebrow, taking a step back. "Wait a minute," he said, clearly trying to process the situation. "Did you just say this is a police vehicle?" I nodded, my grin widening. "Yep. An unmarked government-issued vehicle." Karen's face drained of color. She started blinking faster, her hands trembling as she tried to come up with an excuse. Any excuse. That doesn't make any sense. She finally stammered, her voice wavering. "There are no police in this neighborhood. That car shouldn't be here." I couldn't help but laugh. "Karen? You don't get to decide where undercover officers live. For the record, my wife has been living here longer than you have." At that, Karen let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. It was almost like a nervous tick as she flailed, trying to regain some control. "This is a misunderstanding," she stammered. But the words lacked conviction. The tow truck driver wasn't buying it. His arms were crossed as he glanced at the car, then back at Karen. "So let me get this straight," he said, his tone shifting to disbelief. "You called me to tow an unmarked police vehicle." Karen's mouth flapped uselessly as she struggled to put together a response. The situation was slipping out of her hands faster than she could control it. She tried to salvage the situation by scrambling for some last-minute justification. But there was no way out of this. She had made the biggest mistake of her HOA presidency. And everyone was watching. Karen's face twisted in frustration as the weight of her mistake settled in. She had miscalculated everything, from her assumptions about the car to the power she thought she wielded as HOA president. The smug grin that had been plastered on her face just moments ago had now completely evaporated. Now, she looked like a deer caught in headlights, her fingers nervously clutching her laminated rulebook as if it might somehow save her. I didn't know it was yours," she stammered, her voice growing more frantic. "I was just doing my job as HOA president, enforcing the community standards." "It's a mistake." Her words rushed out in a panic. But the damage was done by now. The sound of neighbors gathering had become a noticeable buzz, the murmur of voices growing louder as they stepped outside to witness the spectacle. Some watched from their front porches, others from their windows, drawn in by the commotion. I couldn't help but enjoy the scene unfolding before me. Karen, who had once instilled fear in the neighborhood with her petty violations and control tactics, was now the subject of ridicule, harassment. Karen suddenly screamed, her voice high-pitched and desperate. She threw her hands up in the air, trying to salvage whatever dignity she could. "I'm being harassed. I'm just following the rules. Why is this happening to me?" But the crowd wasn't buying it. One neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, couldn't hold back a smirk. "Looks like the queen of the HOA is finally getting a taste of her own medicine," she murmured, loud enough for Karen to hear. "About time," another neighbor added, clearly enjoying the scene. "She fined me $200 last month for leaving my garbage can out for an extra 30 minutes. The laughter and whispers only grew louder. And Karen's face flushed redder than I'd ever seen it. She was no longer the imposing figure she used to be, she was just another neighborhood joke. The tow truck driver, who had been patiently waiting through this whole charade, finally decided he'd had enough of Karen's attempts to wriggle out of this mess. His patience was thinning. "Look, lady," he said, his voice flat and uninterested. "You called me here to tow a police vehicle. And now you're trying to backpedal. I'm done with this." He crossed his arms, his tone hardening. "You owe me a call-out fee for wasting my time. Pay up, or there's gonna be trouble." Karen, her face now a deep shade of crimson, turned to the driver with disbelief. "I'm not paying for this," she snapped, her voice shaking with frustration. "This is all your fault." The tow truck driver just shrugged. "Not my problem. You requested the tow. And now you pay the price. You can't just expect me to drive off without getting paid." He was calm, but his words were cutting. The situation had become too absurd for him to take seriously anymore. The crowd had completely gathered now, some neighbors even holding their phones out, recording the interaction. I could hear the whispers of the crowd, "She finds us for the smallest things. But look at her now. She's in over her head." The tension was palpable. I looked over at my wife, who had now stepped outside, sensing the spectacle unfolding in front of our home. As soon as she took in the scene, Karen panicking, the tow truck driver demanding payment, and the neighbors watching with amusement, her expression shifted from confusion to barely contained amusement. Karen, realizing that she was losing control of the situation entirely, tried to deflect again. "This is harassment. I'm being humiliated," she shrieked, her voice wobbling as she turned toward the crowd. But the neighbors weren't about to come to her rescue. In fact, they seemed to enjoy the sight of Karen, who had ruled over their lives with petty fines and oppressive rules, now getting a taste of her own medicine. At that moment, I could tell that Karen was nearing the breaking point. She wasn't going to be able to talk her way out of this one. And, to be honest, I was enjoying every second of it. The following days were filled with an eerie calm. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't the type to let things go. It wasn't long before my suspicions were confirmed. Early one morning, I found a new letter in my mailbox. And as I opened it, I couldn't help but chuckle. It was a formal violation notice, citing that I had parked a commercial vehicle in my driveway, the same car that Karen had just tried to tow, the one she had publicly humiliated herself over. I shook my head in disbelief. "She really doesn't know when to quit," I muttered, showing the notice to my wife. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. Karen wasn't about to let the public humiliation slide. She was going to retaliate. And I had to be ready for it. Sure enough, over the next few days, I began receiving violation notices left and right. First, it was for my car again. Then, suddenly, I was cited for an unauthorized porch decoration, which, to no one's surprise, was simply a fall wreath that my wife had hung up. It was comical, the absurdity of it all. Each notice seemed more ridiculous than the last. My wife and I exchanged looks as I stacked them up on the kitchen counter. "She's throwing everything at the wall, hoping something sticks," my wife remarked, watching as the pile grew higher. "She's desperate." But the more Karen retaliated, the clearer it became, she was digging her own grave. What she didn't realize was that her every move was now under scrutiny. Our neighborhood had witnessed her power trip firsthand. And no one was about to let her get away with it. I wasn't just going to sit back and let her continue harassing us. I began to gather evidence. Keeping a record of every violation letter. Every absurd citation. I took photos of my legal exemption from the city, proving that Karen's claims were baseless. I also kept a copy of the report detailing her previous attempt to tow a police vehicle, which had now become public knowledge. Every piece of documentation was carefully filed away. A growing mountain of evidence against her abuse of power. One evening, as I reviewed the documents with my wife, I made a decision. It was time to take action. I packaged everything, every letter, every report, every detail, and sent it directly to the city's legal department. The weight of it all was almost satisfying. I knew this would be the nail in Karen's coffin. Within 24 hours, I received a response. The city officials were taking the matter seriously. The HOA's practices, especially Karen's overreach, were under investigation. And within just 2 days, things began to shift. City officials showed up at Karen's doorstep, ready to inform her that her reign of terror was over. They weren't just addressing my complaints, they were investigating the entire HOA system she had been running with such an iron fist. The day the city officials arrived at Karen's door, it was like the weight of the world was finally crashing down on her. I had been waiting for this moment, the moment when Karen's unchecked power would come back to haunt her. I could barely contain my excitement as I watched city inspectors walk up to her front porch. The same porch where she had once stood, issuing petty fines and enforcing rules with a sense of superiority. As they knocked on her door, Karen didn't know what hit her. She opened the door. Her usual perfect appearance, her pastel cardigan and pearls, betraying the chaos brewing beneath the surface. The look of shock that washed over her face was priceless. The officials informed her that her actions had triggered a full investigation into her abuse of power. They weren't just here for me, they were here for her entire operation. The HOA, it seemed, had violated multiple housing codes and had been found guilty of harassment and fraud. Karen's face drained of all color as the officials explained she was being removed from her position immediately. She tried to argue, but there was no denying it, her reign of terror over the neighborhood was over. The city slapped her with fines for the abuse of power, fraudulent reporting, and the harassment of residents. The weight of the investigation had caught up with her, and there was no escaping it. It wasn't just her position that was at stake. The investigation revealed far more than Karen's petty rules. As the city dug deeper into the HOA's financial records, they uncovered her financial misconduct, embezzlement. Karen had been siphoning funds from the HOA for years, funneling it into a personal slush fund. There were fake expenses, falsified maintenance reports, and even evidence of Karen covering up her theft with phony billing. The final blow came when criminal charges were filed against her. She had gone too far. The neighborhood was buzzing with excitement. And it wasn't just because Karen had been caught. It was because the entire HOA system was crumbling with her. The investigation revealed just how deeply corrupt the system had become under her watch. And it wasn't long before Karen was slapped with a formal court case. I remember the day I saw the officers arrive at her door to serve her court documents. It was surreal. Karen, who had once looked down on us all, now stood in front of the very people she had terrorized. Shaking as the officers handed her the papers, she stammered in disbelief. "This can't be happening," she whispered, barely able to comprehend the situation. A few weeks later, Karen was officially charged with fraud and embezzlement. The court froze her assets, seized her bank accounts, and banned her from ever owning property in any HOA-run community again. It was over for her. The city was done with her. And so was the neighborhood. As the news of Karen's downfall spread, there was a celebration unlike any I had ever seen. Neighbors who had once feared her began to gather in the streets, sharing the good news. Some even brought out champagne to toast the end of Karen's reign. Music filled the air as the sound of laughter and cheers echoed through the neighborhood. It was a moment of pure liberation, freedom from the oppressive rules Karen had forced upon us for years. But the best part? The HOA was officially disbanded. Without Karen's iron grip on the community, things began to change. People decorated their front yards as they pleased. Kids played outside without worrying about noise violations. Families began to feel a sense of freedom they hadn't experienced in years. I remember sitting on my porch one evening, the sun setting in the distance, as my wife and I looked out over the neighborhood. There was peace in the air, a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. Karen was gone. The HOA was no more. And the neighborhood had been restored. It was a victory for us all. In the end, Karen had learned the hard way that no amount of control could save her. The price of abusing power was far higher than she ever anticipated. And she paid with the destruction of her reputation, her position, and her freedom. As for the rest of us, we were finally free to live in peace. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of HOA drama, power struggles, and the rise and fall of neighborhood tyrants, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. That way, you won't miss any of our future stories that dive into the chaotic world of HOA Karens. Thanks for watching. And stay tuned for the next episode.